Good afternoon. My name is Mitch Robertson, and I'm the Director of Enterprise Systems at Curo Financial. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about gaining knowledge with Ipconfig. As a consultant, oftentimes I went into places and had to get information about the environment rather quickly. You go in, you're tasked with deploying a product or deploying a system, and oftentimes it's important for you to figure out how things are already configured and what's already going on in the environment. And so this is really kind of how to gain some of that knowledge. Bad thing is most of the attackers in today's society, when they attack a system, this is one of the first things they do. So it gets more information for them about the environment. So this applies to both the idea of prevention or the idea of understanding what an attacker does, but it also provides you with additional information that can really help you understand more about an environment. So I'm going to try to explain this and why is Ipconfig all a valuable tool. So when you run an Ipconfig all, you'll get some information like this. You'll get things like the host name, the primary DNS suffix. This is really important, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. But it's kind of important information. You'll get node type, which most people look at that and go, whatever. That can be important under certain circumstances, and I'm going to explain that, and it has a lot to do with name resolution. IP routing enabled, so is this box set up as a Windows router? Does it do some IP routing for you? Very unlikely, but I've definitely seen Windows systems do. Is a Wins proxy enabled on this box? Most likely not. Hopefully most people are going away from Wins, so not as big a deal. This DNS suffix search list is huge. Gives a lot of information about environment, also tells you some things about what's going to happen when you query a DNS name by host name only, or do you need to fully qualify it? Would it help speed things up by fully qualifying it? I don't know, but some good things to think about. Gives you some Ethernet adapter information. Again, connection-specific DNS suffix search. Hopefully it's the same as the primary DNS suffix search, but there are times when that could be different. The description, what kind of Ethernet adapter it is. The physical address, so the MAC address. This is important when you start looking at the layer 2 information. So we're down here talking about this physical address, and that's kind of important. Is DHCP enabled? Do I get my IP address automatically from a DHCP server? So that's another big fact that is really important to be able to pull from this. Is auto configuration enabled? We'll get into that a little bit later, probably not in this session. Link local IPv6 address. If IPv6 is enabled, are you going to see the link local IPv6 address? You might also see some IPv6 addresses for other things, because IPv6 will often issue sometimes 3 or 4 IP addresses. The IPv4 preferred address. If you have multiple IP addresses assigned to this NIC, it'll show up. It might also show additional and Ethernet adapters as well as when you do this. It shows the subnet mask. When was the lease obtained? When is it going to expire? So did I get a new lease? Is it going to expire soon? The default gateway, DHCP v6 IAID, and more DHCP v6 stuff. And then the DNS servers that are that I'm going to use, right? So when you go back to my www.google.com videos and we talk about those, these are the DNS servers that we're using. This is how your client finds a DNS server. It's because it's given to it in DHCP configuration. If you use static IP addressing, somebody has to assign the DNS servers. So it's always a good idea to take a look at this, because if you're having connectivity problems, again, I always start with DNS because it's kind of the first thing that happens. And you try an NS lookup. NS lookup is going to go to this first one right here. That's where it's going to go to first. If you want to check the other 2 servers, or if it gets a timeout when you do an NS lookup for something, maybe you want to check the other 2 servers. Maybe they're responding and the first one isn't. So that's kind of important information. And then this last piece, this net BIOS over TCP IP, is really important, and it comes back and has something to do with this node type. So I'm going to kind of bounce around and explain some things to you, but right now, just by looking at this, I've already established some information. I have my client, right? Wow, my pen isn't working very well. That's okay. I'll slow down. My client, I know that my gateway, which is usually a router or in a home setting, might be my firewall and my router. I know that's 192.168. Excuse me. 8.1.1. And so I already know what my gateway is, and I know what my client is. I also know that I have a DNS server out here, so I know that I've got something else out here that's 192.168.1.2. But I also know I'm getting my DNS from my router. This is oftentimes an indicator of a small, cheap router in an environment, but not always. That's a possibility. There's some other reasons why I do that as well. So it's kind of cool when you get into that. But I already know a lot about my environment just from this information alone. I also know my domain is called domain A, or I can assume it is for now until I prove otherwise. I also know that they probably have a DNS suffix search list, and so they've probably got some other domain in here called domain B. And so I know when I do a DNS request for something like www.domain.a or www. Or just www for a host name, then it's going to add domaina.com to it, and it's going to add domainb.com to it. So I'm going to have multiple DNS requests that go out. So that's always good to know. If my DHCP server was different than my router, I would also know that I have another device, right? So I'd have 3 devices that I would know something about. So just from this information, I've already found out a lot of stuff. So it's really important to take all of that into account and understand what you're getting, right? What is it that comes out of that ipconfig all? I get that host name. I get the primary DNS suffix search list. I get the DNS suffix search list. I get the node type, and I'm going to talk about that here in just a minute. I get the MAC address. Is DHCP enabled? Is auto configuration enabled? Auto configuration is that 169. I can't even remember the next set of digits for it, but it's a 169 something something address, right? The IPv4 address for this computer, the subnet mask, if it has an IPv6 address, that'll show up. The default gateway and all the DNS servers. So I've actually established a lot of information, and I've also established that NetBIOS over TCP/IP is disabled. Interesting thing about that is if NetBIOS over TCP/IP is disabled, that means this node type is of no value. Don't need to worry about any of the NetBIOS stuff because the node type has to do with NetBIOS, and let me show you. Yeah, you get the computer name primary DNS suffix search, right? But you get this NetBIOS node type. And so there's 4 node types. There's B node, P node, M node, and H node. H node is hybrid mode, which most people are configured for. It just says I'm going to use the P node first and then B node, and P node is point to point. So in this environment, name queries go directly to the Win server first if there was a Win server. And if not, then I'm going to broadcast it and go to the broadcast functionality of it. If you have Wins enabled, if you have this functionality set up, there is some risk to it because I can query for the name of the computer on that network. I can even query it remotely, fairly easy, and do NetBIOS name resolution of multiple machines fairly quickly. So that's something that attackers like to see. So when they do that ipconfig all, they look to see what node type it is, and then they look to see if TCP over IP NetBIOS is enabled. If it's disabled, they'll still try it in the environment to see whether I can get to other NetBIOS stuff. Maybe I don't have it disabled everywhere, but it's always one more thing that makes it a little harder for them to move around or to find what they're looking for quickly. Granted, there's a lot of other things they can do, but that's the one thing that's really easy. When they do a scan and they find an IP address that's responding, then they can do a NetBIOS lookup for it and query it directly and get a NetBIOS name return. So if NetBIOS is disabled, it's really a good thing. If NetBIOS is disabled, then this whole process goes away. You don't even have to worry about it anymore. So I recommend to people that they turn off NetBIOS. It does create some challenges, and a few administrators don't like that, but you'll learn to compensate for it over time. So it's just another vector for somebody to do a lot of queries to find out more about your environment. Admins like using it, but again, so does the bad guy. And is it really necessary? It's actually extra work for your system to go through and do the query for the Win server. If the Win server is not available, do the query for or broadcast query for the name. And oftentimes you have weird things happen, like I ping a name, I ping name, or I ping Fred, and Fred returns an IP address. And when I ping fred.domaina.com, it returns a different IP address, or I do an NS lookup for Fred, and because of the suffix search setup, I get a return for fred.domaina.com, but it's totally different than what my ping returns. So this is one of those cases that I just like to have it turned off. I think it's a good idea, and it just makes it a little less easy for attackers to find out information about your environment. You'll find that most things don't use it anymore. You might have to make some adjustments in some printers and copiers, but most of the time you can turn it off and not have too much of a problem, especially if you're on Windows 7 or Windows 10. I've seen a lot of environments that are able to turn it off without any effect. There might be a few old applications that still use it, but a lot of places can turn this off with limited problems. If you have something like RevealX, you can actually watch and turn this off and see if you still have some of the queries happen and what you can do about it. So really a good thing to do. So this is the settings in a Windows box. If you take a look, just disabling this NetBIOS over TCP, and this can be done through the DHCP server as well. You disable that NetBIOS over TCP, or you can set a group policy, if I remember right, to disable this. So that's really a good thing. Highly recommend it. So it's kind of important to do. So if you've got time, subscribe to my channel. Take a look at some of the other videos I've got going on. I appreciate your time. I'm going to try to do more of these little tidbits like this. I think it's valuable. I will tell you this, that this information changes so fast in the industry that sometimes stuff I think I'm right on, it ends up being wrong. That's okay. I love to learn. So if you think I'm wrong on something, put it down in the comments. Challenge me a little bit. Ask questions about it. Love to get something going where we're having a little more of a discussion and see how it goes. I appreciate your time. Thank you. Have a great evening. And oh, by the way, I will try to get my TLS one done for the www.google.com stack. That just takes a little more time because there's a lot of information in the TLS traces that I've got to pull out and kind of establish for everybody. So I appreciate your time. Thanks again. Have a great evening.